Well, he's not charged with any crime, but House Speaker Robert DeLeo is very much on trial in the court of public opinion. That's because he's become embroiled in the corruption trial involving former Probation Department officials, which is now coming to a close. In over 10 weeks of testimony, there were few bombshells at the Moakley Courthouse, where former Probation Commissioner John O'Brien and 2 deputies faced federal corruption charges. Most of the major details came to light in 2010, when the Boston Globe Spotlight team exposed rampant patronage hiring at the Probation Department, and how O'Brien and his deputies allegedly ran a bogus hiring system to conceal the patronage. State House politicians had largely sidestepped the scandal, but that all changed last week when federal prosecutors told the court that House Speaker Robert DeLeo had, quote, a quid pro quo relationship with O'Brien. They say DeLeo provided legislative favors to O'Brien in exchange for O'Brien hiring DeLeo's favored applicants. DeLeo isn't charged in the case and is lashing out at federal prosecutors.
Any statements or any innuendos that there were any quid pro quo in terms of jobs or money or whatever is false and untrue. And anyone who says that knows it's untrue.
Jurors will decide that for themselves later this week. So how damaging could this trial be for Speaker DeLeo? Here to hash it out are WGBH political analyst David Bernstein, who's also a contributing editor at Boston Magazine, and WGBH News senior web editor Peter Kadzis. Guys, welcome to you both.
Hey.
So Speaker DeLeo is not a defendant in this case, and yet he really is on trial in a very real sense. Is he getting a raw deal, do you think?
Well, that kind of depends on what you think of the prosecution's case. If you think that the prosecution, if you agree with the prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office that there was a criminal conspiracy here and that Bob DeLeo, as the prosecutors allege, that Bob DeLeo was an active, knowing participant, but that they just didn't have enough evidence against him and witnesses against him to charge him as a, so he's an unindicted co-conspirator. If you buy that case, then he's actually getting a good deal because he, he's guilty of something and is getting away with it. If, like a lot of people do, you think that this is overblown, that this doesn't belong in court, or that maybe O'Brien was doing something illegal, but that anyone else was just doing normal, patronage, then yeah, he is getting a raw deal. So it really depends on what you think of the case.
Peter, which of those two camps do you come down in?
Listen, I subscribe to the Speaker DeLeo's getting a raw deal, and I'm somewhat surprised to hear myself say that, because when this trial began, I did not have a lot of sympathy for any of the elected officials who might have been struck by the mud flying. I think what the U.S. Attorney has done to Speaker DeLeo is, in its own way, as outrageous as what the Beacon Hill establishment was doing with patronage. It's not a crime. But it's not something you want to endorse.
Let's talk on that count a little more about the legal principles involved here, because I have not been in court for the trial. I've tried to pay close attention, and it's really tough to understand what does and doesn't constitute a crime here. Am I right that in sum, patronage itself is not a crime? The judge has said that again and again, but covering up patronage could constitute a criminal act, a racketeering act, or fraud. Is that the gist, safe to say?
That's a reasonable summation. It's the cover-up is always worse than the underlying crime, and and you could use telephones or the mail or the internet as a means of covering it up. I mean, look, our friend Javi Silverglade, who's sometimes on the show, has written a book that points out that the federal government could indict a ham sandwich if they wanted to. That's what this case is all about, indicting a ham sandwich.
Well, but on the other hand, and I am generally sympathetic to that side of the argument, but it's also the case that if you were to think of these employment opportunities as contracts that the government has, in some cases you have contracts that are set up to be given away, by earmark, or just give them to whoever the legislature says give them to. So in that sense, if it's set up that way, that's the way it's set up. But if you've got contracts that are set up to be given under a certain scheme to the most meritorious, so forth, and if it turns out that you've got a whole system devised. It's not just covering up, but it's actually a whole system in order to circumvent the way you're supposed to be doing it, in order to give it to someone who's not qualified. And again, that's a key part legally. Were they giving it to someone who was clearly not as qualified as others?
Hence the fraud component.
Yeah, no, but it is very complicated to suss that out, especially by the evidence that's come out.
I'll tell you, I think David's analogy with contracts is a very good one. And listen, make no mistake, this was outrageous. The public good was not served.
Individuals who were not qualified to get fairly lucrative probation jobs were given them over unqualified.
I would argue, as the Speaker did in his statement, that people buy ambassadorships. They're political appointees who are not qualified, appointed all the time.
We also got to mention the fact that the Speaker, because I don't think we've highlighted this yet, he's accused of basically trading jobs that he knew he could mete out to various state representatives in order to have them elect him as Speaker when he succeeded Sal DeMacy. So that's where he comes in, allegedly.
Right, and it becomes very complicated because some of the stuff that they're sort of alleging that he did is not part of the trial because it happened after this stuff became public, because that's when the actual speakership fight happened. And so they aren't including any of that stuff, even though they're sort of hinting at it in public. And so it becomes very convoluted, some of the things they're talking about. And they also don't have a lot of direct evidence that that's what happened.
What are the implications, I'm sorry, Peter, for Bob DeLeo as Speaker of the House, and the implications in this election year as we head into a governor's race?
That's right where I was going to go. This, in practical terms, this is no longer about the law. This is about politics.
I agree.
And what to me is interesting is, what's this mean for Charlie Baker? And I suppose the Democrats, as opposed to the Republican running, you're elected governor by running against Beacon Hill, by running against the House, by running against the Senate. You know, Deval Patrick, people may forget, that's how he was elected. That's how Mitt Romney was elected. Salucci gets a pass on that because he was from there. That's how Bill Weld was elected. Yep. You're elected governor by running against the House. However, if whoever is elected governor, especially if it's Baker, will have to work with the Speaker, presuming Mr. DeLeo is still in office, which I think he will be. So there's a conundrum there.
And there's also an issue for the House members who do face re-election. And a lot of what DeLeo has been doing the past week or so has been a lot, in my opinion, about internal politics in the State House, in the House of Representatives, where he wants to show that he can stand up and defend them from this sort of general notion that they were all trading their vote for him for something else, and that all of this behind the scenes stuff. He was really standing up not just for himself, but to say, I'm going to protect you all. And as I said in another format recently,
which we'll talk about in a moment, yes.
I believe, as some sources have been telling me over the course of many months, that Speaker DeLeo wants to try to extend his speakership beyond the 8-year term limit. There are ways for him to try to do that he would presumably be trying to get cooperation with next year. He has 2 years left before the term limit. He wants to extend that. Most people that I talk to think that he can get that if he wants to, but that's under current circumstances a little tougher if the general public is looking at him as this unindicted co-conspirator who cheated his way to getting the speakership in the first place. So he does need to head off that sense.
All right, David Bernstein, Peter Kadzis, thank you both for joining us.